Unpopular opinion, but being a man in today's world might actually be one of the hardest jobs on the planet. And here's why. So check this out. Women say they want sensitivity, but not too much sensitivity. Share your emotions, but don't you dare share too many or suddenly you are weak. They say be a good leader, but in the same breath, I'm not following you anywhere because I'm Miss Independent. How does that even work? They want strength with just the right amount of vulnerability, honesty, but not so honest that it points out their flaws. Because then you are the bad guy. They expect you to read their damn mind, but if you assume what they're thinking, you're wrong. Be financially stable, but also have endless free time to give all your attention to me. Because doesn't financial stability take time to build? When you hear these requests out loud, you realize how much they contradict each other. Sounds confusing, right? But imagine being the man who's expected to figure all of this out. So here's the question. Do men really have it easier? Or are we just not being honest about how impossible these expectations really are? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I know this one is going to spark a debate.
There is a quiet shift happening in society that most people did not notice until it was already well underway. And that shift is not loud or dramatic or announced with protests or headlines, but it is unmistakable once you see it. It is the sound of absence. It is the silence where conversations used to happen, where approaches used to be made, where attention once flowed freely and predictably. This video is about that silence, why it exists, how it formed over decades rather than months, and why so many people are suddenly confused by its presence. If you stay until the very end, you will understand why this change is not temporary, why it is not emotional, and why it will not reverse, simply because some people wish it would. Before we get into it, take a moment to like the video if you find value here. Share it with someone who has noticed the same patterns. Subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell and select all if you want to get every single Angry Guy video the moment we release it. That support helps this channel grow and ensures these conversations continue. I also want to remind you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy if you are serious about protecting and safeguarding your assets and growing your wealth. The Academy is designed to teach you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, and it is linked in the description of this video, so go check it out now. And if you're enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show direct support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It keeps the lights on and the content coming. Now, let us talk about what is actually happening, because this story did not begin yesterday, and it did not begin with one app, one trend, or one generation. What we are seeing today is the result of long-term incentives colliding with human behavior, reinforced by institutions, amplified by social media, and finally answered by withdrawal rather than confrontation. Men, in large numbers, have stopped speaking to women in public, online, and in casual social environments. And the most interesting part is not that this is happening, but that so many people seem genuinely shocked by it. For decades, men were told very clearly what was expected of them and what was not. They were told where they were welcome and where they were not. They were told which behaviors were acceptable and which would be interpreted as suspicious, inappropriate, or threatening. They were told that traditional social roles were outdated, that initiative was unnecessary, that masculinity itself was something to be corrected rather than understood. Over time, the message became consistent enough that it no longer needed repeating. When a system delivers the same feedback long enough, behavior changes, not out of spite, but out of learning. And what we are witnessing now is not rebellion. It is adaptation. Men did not wake up one day and collectively decide to disengage. They responded to incentives, consequences, and repeated outcomes. They observed patterns, adjusted accordingly, and found that disengagement carried fewer risks than participation. That is not anger. That is cost-benefit analysis. And once a behavior pattern proves stable and peaceful, it tends to stick. In previous generations, social interaction between men and women was encouraged and structured. There were norms, expectations, and mutual responsibilities. Over time, many of those structures were removed or reframed in a way that placed risk asymmetrically. Public interaction became uncertain. Social missteps carried consequences that were not merely embarrassing, but potentially permanent in digital spaces. The margin for misunderstanding shrank, while the consequences for misunderstanding expanded. At the same time, language changed. New terms entered mainstream conversation, not as descriptive tools, but as moral judgments. Everyday behavior was reinterpreted through adversarial lenses. Men were told not only what not to do, but that their intentions were suspect by default. When that message is repeated in media, education, and online discourse, it eventually becomes internalized not as an argument to fight, but as a condition to avoid. Many men responded initially by trying harder to comply, to learn the rules, to be more cautious, more considerate, more restrained. But caution does not eliminate risk when interpretation itself is subjective. Over time, the simplest solution became absence. Do not approach, do not initiate, do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Silence, it turns out, is the safest form of compliance, and this withdrawal was not dramatic. It happened gradually. First, fewer messages, then fewer approaches, then avoidance of environments where misinterpretation was likely. Gyms, workplaces, public transit, social gatherings, eye contact became optional, conversation became transactional. The goal shifted from connection to neutrality. And neutrality, when sustained long enough, becomes habit. What surprised many observers was not that men changed their behavior, but that they did not come back once criticism softened or narrative shifted. That is because something else happened during that period of withdrawal. Men discovered that absence brought peace. They discovered that being alone is not the same as feeling lonely. They discovered that removing constant social pressure created mental clarity rather than emptiness. When you remove a recurring stressor from your life and feel better, you do not rush to reintroduce it. That is not bitterness. That is self preservation. Many men realized that their time, attention, and resources were finite, and that investing them elsewhere produced more predictable returns. Hobbies, fitness, learning, financial stability, quiet routines. These things do not judge intent or reinterpret past actions. They simply reward consistency. This shift also coincided with broader economic pressure. As costs rose and stability became harder to achieve, men began prioritizing control over their environments. Simpler lives, smaller circles, fewer obligations, less emotional turbulence, minimalism, not as an aesthetic, but as a strategy. When you control fewer variables, you experience fewer disruptions. At the same time, social media platforms accelerated comparison and conflict. Short form content rewarded outrage and exaggeration. Extreme perspectives gained visibility because they drove engagement. In that environment, nuanced discussion lost ground to viral narratives. Men watching from the sidelines learned quickly that participation often meant being framed rather than understood. Platforms like TikTok amplified this effect by condensing complex social dynamics into emotionally charged clips. A single moment, stripped of context, could define someone publicly. That reality changed how people behaved offline as well as online. When the cost of misinterpretation becomes too high, rational actors opt out. And what we are seeing now is the downstream effect of years of messaging colliding with human psychology. People adapt to avoid harm. When avoidance proves effective, it becomes the default. Men did not leave because they were defeated. They left because they were done negotiating unclear rules with unclear outcomes. For many women, this shift feels sudden. Attention that once existed as background noise is now gone. Social feedback loops that were once reliable have weakened. That absence is often interpreted as hostility, but it is more accurately described as disengagement. There is a difference. Hostility seeks reaction, disengagement seeks peace. The hardest truth in this conversation is that systems teach behavior, When a system repeatedly punishes participation and rewards withdrawal, withdrawal becomes the learned response. You cannot reverse that overnight with appeals or frustration. Trust, once eroded, does not regenerate on command. Men who have stepped away are not organizing, protesting, or demanding change. That alone should tell you something. They are not asking for reform because they are not seeking reentry. They are building lives that do not require approval or validation. They are opting out of dynamics they no longer find beneficial. And this does not mean society collapses tomorrow. It means social contracts are being rewritten quietly, not through legislation, but through behavior. When enough people change how they interact, norms shift, whether institutions approve or not. That is how culture actually changes, not through slogans, but through millions of small personal decisions. It is also important to say this clearly. This is not about hatred. Hatred is loud and unstable. This is about indifference. Indifference is calm, sustainable, and extremely difficult to reverse. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. When someone stops arguing with you, it does not mean you won. It often means they no longer see value in the exchange. Men who have walked away often describe an unexpected sense of relief, fewer expectations, fewer misunderstandings, fewer social negotiations. They are not chasing approval or defending their intentions. They are focusing on what they can control and letting go of what they cannot. This is why calls for men to return to old patterns are unlikely to succeed. Those patterns no longer offer the same rewards and carry greater risk. Without structural change, appeals to emotion will not overcome lived experience. People trust what they observe over what they are told. And this brings us to the core of the issue. Observable reality shapes behavior more powerfully than ideology. When men observe that disengagement leads to stability, peace, and progress, they internalize that lesson. Once internalized, it becomes identity, not just strategy. We are entering a phase where fewer assumptions can be made about social interaction. Attention is no longer guaranteed. Initiative is no longer expected. Silence is no longer a signal of insecurity. It is often a signal of contentment. The question is not whether this trend will continue, but whether society will adapt to it honestly. That requires acknowledging cause and effect without denial or blame. It requires understanding that people respond rationally to incentives, even when those responses are uncomfortable to witness. At this point in the video, I want to ask you to think about what you have observed in your own life. Not what you have been told, but what you have seen. Fewer conversations, more distance, more people choosing solitude without shame. Patterns do not lie, even when narratives try to overwrite them. As we continue, we are going to explore how this shift affects relationships, economics, mental health, and long-term social stability, and why attempts to shame or pressure men back into old roles are not only ineffective, but counterproductive. This is not about nostalgia. It is about adaptation in a changing environment. Before we move deeper, ask yourself this. When someone leaves a situation and becomes calmer, healthier, and more focused, what incentive do they have to return? That question matters more than any argument, and the answer explains more than most people are willing to admit. When men began choosing peace over participation, something subtle but profound happened beneath the surface of everyday life. The absence of conflict did not create emptiness. Instead, it created space. Space to think, space to evaluate, space to notice how much energy had previously been spent navigating expectations that were never clearly defined and outcomes that were rarely fair. Many men realized that a large portion of their stress was not coming from work, finances, or responsibility, but from constant social calibration. Once that calibration stopped, the mental noise faded. This is where many observers misunderstand the situation. They assume men left because they could not compete or adapt. In reality, men adapted precisely by leaving. Adaptation does not always mean staying in the environment that produces stress. Sometimes adaptation means recognizing that the environment itself is inefficient or hostile to well being. Evolution favors energy conservation. Humans are no different. When effort no longer correlates with reward, effort declines. Men began asking themselves hard questions that they had never been encouraged to ask before. What am I actually getting out of this? What risks am I assuming that I cannot control? Why am I constantly expected to prove good intentions rather than simply be neutral? These questions were not fueled by resentment, they were fueled by fatigue. And fatigue leads to simplification. Simplification is not weakness, it is optimization. When men simplified their lives, they removed unnecessary variables, fewer social obligations, fewer emotional entanglements, fewer situations where their words or actions could be misinterpreted after the fact. This was not about rejecting connection entirely, it was about choosing connection carefully. Over time, this selective engagement reshaped identity. Men stopped defining themselves through external validation. They stopped measuring their worth by attention received or approval granted. Instead, they focused on internal metrics: physical health, financial stability, skill acquisition, personal routines. Quiet competence replaced performative confidence. This shift also altered how men viewed time. Time became something to protect rather than spend freely. Once you experience the benefit of uninterrupted focus, you become reluctant to trade it for chaos. Many men discovered that solitude, when chosen rather than imposed, is not lonely, it is restorative. Meanwhile, the broader social environment continued operating on outdated assumptions. Media narratives still portrayed men as eager participants waiting to be guided, corrected, or included. When reality failed to match that expectation, confusion followed. Some interpreted withdrawal as hostility, others framed it as immaturity. Very few acknowledged it as a rational response to incentives. The most telling sign that something fundamental has changed is that men are not asking to be understood. They are not lobbying for sympathy. They are not demanding reform. They are simply gone. When people stop arguing for their position, it often means they have already moved on. This silence unsettles systems that rely on engagement. Attention has always been a form of currency. When men stop spending it freely, markets and dynamics shift. Social validation loops weaken. Expectations go unmet. And for those accustomed to predictable responses, unpredictability feels like loss of control. It is important to clarify that this dynamic is not about punishment or revenge. Men are not withholding attention to teach lessons. That framing assumes emotional investment that no longer exists. Indifference does not aim to correct behavior, it simply redirects energy elsewhere. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this shift is how peaceful it is. There is no drama in opting out quietly. There is no spectacle. That makes it difficult to address because there is nothing to argue against. You cannot debate someone who has already chosen another path. Men who have walked away often describe an unexpected sense of freedom. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from constant social evaluation. They are no longer preoccupied with how they are perceived in ambiguous situations. They are no longer calculating how their presence might be interpreted. That cognitive load is gone. This mental relief compounds over time. When stress decreases, clarity increases. When clarity increases, priorities sharpen. Many men report becoming more disciplined, more focused, and more content. These outcomes reinforce the decision to disengage. Another factor driving this trend is pattern recognition. Humans learn through experience. When men observe repeated cycles where effort leads to criticism rather than appreciation, they adjust. When they see that disengagement leads to stability, they reinforce it. Behavior follows patterns, not slogans. Attempts to reframe this shift as a crisis often miss the point. From the perspective of men who have opted out, this is not a collapse, it is a correction, a recalibration towards sustainability. They are not seeking to dismantle society, they are simply choosing not to be consumed by it. This recalibration also affects how men approach relationships. They are no longer entering interactions with assumptions. They are cautious, observant, and selective. They prioritize transparency over intensity, peace over excitement, predictability over novelty. These preferences are shaped by experience, not ideology. Some critics argue that this withdrawal is unhealthy or antisocial. That argument ignores outcomes. Men who disengage often report improved mental health, stronger routines, and greater self respect. Health is measured by results, not by adherence to outdated norms. There is also a generational component to this shift. Younger men grew up observing the consequences faced by older men. They learned vicariously. They did not need to repeat the same mistakes to understand the risks. When a lesson is demonstrated clearly enough, it spreads without instruction. Technology accelerated this learning process. Stories, experiences, and cautionary tales traveled faster than ever before. Men compared notes. Patterns became visible. Once patterns are recognized, they cannot be unseen. And another overlooked aspect is how this shift aligns with economic reality. As financial pressures increase, risk tolerance decreases. Men are less willing to gamble with time, money, or reputation. Stability becomes a priority. When social engagement introduces unpredictable risk, it is deprioritized. This does not mean men have stopped caring about others. It means they have stopped placing themselves in situations where care is penalized or exploited. There's a difference. Caring without boundaries leads to burnout. Caring with boundaries leads to sustainability. The language of boundaries has often been framed as selfish when applied to men. That framing is eroding. Boundaries are now recognized as necessary for mental health across the board. Men are simply applying that principle consistently. One of the reasons this shift feels jarring is that it contradicts long standing narratives about male behavior. Men were expected to pursue, initiate, and persist. When they stop doing those things, it creates a vacuum. That vacuum exposes how much social structure depended on male initiative being taken for granted. This exposure is uncomfortable because it forces reconsideration of assumptions. It challenges the idea that participation is mandatory or that disengagement is failure. In reality, disengagement can be a sign of discernment. Another important point is that men are not isolating themselves completely. They are forming smaller, more intentional communities, friendships based on shared interests rather than obligation, activities that provide tangible satisfaction. These connections are quieter, but often more resilient. This quiet resilience does not generate headlines. It does not trend. It simply exists. And because it exists without seeking approval, it is often overlooked. Some people respond to the shift by attempting to shame men back into engagement. That approach misunderstands the psychology involved. Shame only works when people value the opinions of those applying it. Indifference renders shame ineffective. Others attempt to entice men back by promising change without structural follow through. Words without action do not rebuild trust. Trust is built through consistency over time. Once broken, it cannot be restored through urgency. Men who have opted out are watching, not waiting. They observe outcomes, not promises. If environments change demonstrably, some may re engage selectively. But the burden of proof has shifted. Participation is no longer automatic. This is a fundamental power shift that few acknowledge openly. When people stop needing approval, systems lose leverage. That does not mean chaos ensues. It means dynamics rebalance. We are also seeing a redefinition of success. Success is no longer measured solely by social milestones. It is measured by peace, autonomy, and control over one's time. This redefinition is spreading quietly and steadily. Men are discovering that fulfillment does not require constant validation. It requires alignment between effort and outcome. When that alignment exists, motivation follows naturally. The irony is that many of the traits now being cultivated by men who walk away are the same traits that were once encouraged: discipline, self reliance, emotional regulation, focus. The difference is that these traits are now applied inward rather than outward. And this inward application creates stability that does not depend on external affirmation. That stability is difficult to disrupt. Once someone builds a life that feels balanced and predictable, they guard it carefully. As this trend continues, social norms will adjust whether institutions acknowledge it or not. Norms follow behavior, not declarations. When enough people act differently, expectations change. The question facing society is not how to force men back into old roles, but how to build environments where participation is genuinely beneficial for all involved. That requires honesty about incentives, accountability, and mutual respect. Without that honesty, disengagement will remain the rational choice for many. People do not abandon systems that work for them, they abandon systems that drain them. And as we move forward in this discussion, we will examine how this shift impacts long term relationships, population trends, workplace dynamics, and cultural narratives. We will also explore why attempts to pathologize male disengagement miss the root cause and often accelerate the very behavior they seek to prevent. To understand where this leads, you have to understand how habits harden into identity. A short period of disengagement can feel experimental, but a long period of disengagement rewires expectations. Men who initially stepped back as a temporary measure began to realize that nothing essential was missing. In fact, many noticed that their lives were improving in ways they had not anticipated. Stress levels dropped, sleep improved, focus sharpened. When a change delivers benefits across multiple areas of life, it stops being a reaction and becomes a choice. This is where the conversation often goes wrong. Critics assume disengagement is driven by bitterness or defeat. That assumption reveals a misunderstanding of human behavior. People rarely sustain actions that make them miserable. What we are seeing endure is not misery, it is contentment. And contentment does not announce itself loudly. Another misunderstanding is the belief that men are disengaging out of fear. Fear does not produce calm. Fear produces anxiety, vigilance, and agitation. What men describe instead is relief. Relief comes from resolving a conflict, not running from it. The conflict here was between expectations placed on men and the outcomes those expectations produced. Once the conflict was resolved, by opting out, peace followed. This peace reshaped priorities. Men began to structure their days around what felt grounding rather than performative. Morning routines replaced late nights of social obligation. Physical training replaced aimless socializing. Skill building replaced constant messaging. These shifts were not ideological statements, they were practical adjustments. Over time, these adjustments compounded. Small daily choices turned into stable systems. Stable systems created predictability. Predictability reduced anxiety, increased satisfaction. This is how disengagement became self reinforcing. Meanwhile, many public conversations continue to operate as if men were still fully invested in old dynamics. Advice columns, social commentary, and media narratives continued addressing men who were no longer listening. That disconnect created confusion. When messages do not reach their intended audience, the problem is not volume, it is relevance. Men who have stepped away are not consuming content aimed at persuading them to return. They are consuming content that supports their chosen lifestyle. Finance, fitness, craft, travel, solitude. These topics align with autonomy and self direction. Another overlooked factor is how disengagement reduces internal conflict. When you are no longer trying to reconcile contradictory expectations, your mind quiets. There is no longer a need to interpret ambiguous signals or anticipate judgment. Clarity replaces tension. This clarity extends into decision making. Men become more decisive when fewer variables are at play. They say no more often. They commit selectively. They prioritize outcomes over appearances. These traits are often mislabeled as detachment, but they are better described as focus. The social response to this focus has been mixed. Some people respect it, others feel unsettled by it. Focus disrupts dynamics that rely on distraction and dependency. When someone becomes self sufficient emotionally and practically, they are harder to influence. Influence has always depended on leverage. Leverage requires need. When men reduce their need for external validation, leverage diminishes. This is not a power grab, it is a side effect of independence. Another misconception is that men who disengage become apathetic toward society. In reality, many become more invested in systems that demonstrate fairness and reciprocity. They volunteer selectively. They mentor quietly. They support causes that align with observable outcomes. Their engagement becomes intentional rather than obligatory. This intentionality changes the texture of participation. Instead of broad, shallow involvement, men choose narrow, deep commitments, fewer promises, more follow through. This shift favors quality over quantity. There is also an emotional maturity component that deserves attention. Disengagement requires emotional regulation. You cannot step back calmly without processing disappointment, confusion, and frustration internally. Many men did that work privately. They did not broadcast it. They did not seek applause for it. They simply integrated it. That integration is what makes the shift durable. Unprocessed emotion tends to resurface. Processed emotion becomes wisdom. Wisdom does not argue loudly, it observes and adjusts. Another reason this trend is misunderstood is because it lacks a villain. There is no single event to point to, no individual to blame. It is the cumulative result of incentives interacting with human psychology over time. Systems produced outcomes, people responded. That is the entire story. Attempts to simplify it into moral narratives miss the structural mechanics at play. People follow paths that reduce friction. When engagement becomes high friction and low reward, disengagement becomes logical. This logic applies across cultures and eras. The difference now is scale and visibility. Technology allowed men to compare experiences rapidly. Once enough comparisons aligned, confidence in the pattern increased. Confidence matters. When people believe their experiences are isolated, they endure them longer. When they see those experiences mirrored widely, they reassess. Shared recognition accelerates change. Another critical element is that disengagement does not require coordination. It spreads organically. Each individual makes a personal calculation. The aggregate effect appears collective, but the motivation is individual. This decentralization makes the trend resilient. There is no leader to discredit, no organization to dismantle. It is simply behavior adjusting to conditions. As disengagement normalized, stigma weakened. Men no longer felt the need to justify their choices. They stopped explaining, they stopped debating. Silence replaced defense. Silence is powerful because it denies reaction. Many social dynamics rely on feedback loops. When feedback stops, the loop collapses. This collapse is often interpreted as abandonment, but it is more accurately described as non participation. Non participation forces recalibration. Systems built on assumptions of constant engagement must adjust or wither. This is not unique to social relationships. It occurs in markets, institutions, and cultures. We are already seeing signs of this recalibration. Expectations are shifting, advice is changing tone. Some narratives are becoming more conciliatory. These are indicators that leverage has changed. However, recalibration takes time. Trust does not regenerate instantly. People who have optimized their lives around disengagement will not reverse course without compelling evidence that re engagement is beneficial, and benefit must be tangible, not promised, not implied, tangible, stability, respect, predictability, reciprocity. Without these, disengagement remains the rational choice. Another element worth examining is how this shift affects identity formation in younger men. They are growing up with different assumptions. They do not see disengagement as failure. They see it as one option among many. This normalization changes developmental trajectories. Young men are investing earlier in self mastery. They are cautious with commitments. They value autonomy. These traits shape future behavior. Critics often frame this as avoidance, but avoidance does not produce competence. What we are seeing instead is delayed commitment paired with increased preparation. That combination produces different outcomes. Men are not refusing responsibility, they are refusing asymmetry. Responsibility without authority, effort without appreciation, risk without reward. These are poor bargains. Rejecting poor bargains is not avoidance, it is discernment. This discernment also influences how men approach work. They prioritize roles that offer clear metrics and fair compensation. They avoid environments heavy on politics and ambiguity. They seek mastery rather than approval. In personal life, the same principles apply: clear expectations, mutual effort, observable consistency. Where these exist, engagement is possible. Where they do not, disengagement persists. It is important to say this without hostility. This is not an indictment of individuals. It is an analysis of systems. Systems produce incentives. Incentives shape behavior. If you want different behavior, you must change incentives. Moral pressure does not override lived experience. It rarely works and often backfires. This is why attempts to shame men into re engagement are ineffective. Shame assumes dependency on approval. Independence neutralizes shame. Likewise, attempts to provoke guilt fail when people have already made peace with their choices. Guilt requires internal conflict. Peace resolves conflict. Another common error is assuming that men will re engage out of loneliness. That assumption misunderstands solitude. Solitude chosen is not loneliness, it is preference. Loneliness is distress caused by unwanted isolation. Solitude is contentment found in selective connection. Men walking away are practicing the latter, not the former. As long as solitude continues to deliver stability and satisfaction, it will remain attractive. You cannot argue someone out of peace. As disengagement became normalized, a deeper transformation began to unfold, one that is less visible but more consequential. Men stopped orienting their lives around reaction and began orienting them around intention. Reaction is exhausting because it keeps you tethered to external forces. Intention is stabilizing because it places agency back in your hands. This shift changed not just how men interacted with others, but how they understood themselves. For many men, the turning point was not a dramatic incident, but a quiet realization. They noticed that weeks passed without conflict. They noticed that their emotional state was steadier. They noticed that their progress in personal goals accelerated once distractions were removed. These observations did not feel ideological, they felt empirical. When reality delivers consistent feedback, belief follows naturally. This is why arguments that frame male disengagement as a trend that can be reversed with messaging miss the core issue. This is not a messaging problem, it is an outcome problem. People do not abandon practices that improve their lives. They abandon practices that introduce instability without sufficient reward. One of the most significant outcomes of disengagement is how it reshapes self respect. Self respect grows when your actions align with your values and when you stop placing yourself in situations that violate your boundaries. Many men realized that they had been tolerating environments that demanded constant compromise without offering reciprocity. Walking away restored internal alignment. And alignment is powerful because it simplifies decision making. When your values are clear, choices become easier. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop rationalizing discomfort. You either engage where alignment exists or disengage where it does not. This binary clarity replaces emotional turbulence with calm resolve. This clarity also exposes how much social interaction had been driven by obligation rather than desire. Obligation creates resentment over time. Desire creates enthusiasm. When obligation was removed, many men discovered that their desire for certain forms of interaction had been overstated. They were participating out of habit, not fulfillment. Habit is a strong force, but it weakens quickly once interrupted. Once men experienced life without certain social obligations, returning to them felt unnatural. It felt like reintroducing friction into a system that had already been optimized. Another important aspect of the shift is how it affects emotional expression. Contrary to stereotypes, many men report becoming more emotionally stable after disengaging. This stability does not come from suppression, it comes from reduced provocation. When you are no longer constantly navigating ambiguous expectations, emotional volatility decreases. Emotional stability allows for deeper self reflection. Men began examining what they actually wanted rather than what they were told to want. Some realized they preferred quiet routines to constant stimulation. Others discovered satisfaction in craftsmanship, fitness, or learning. These pursuits provide measurable progress and intrinsic reward. Intrinsic reward is key here. When reward comes from within the activity itself, external validation becomes optional. This reduces vulnerability to manipulation and disappointment. Men stopped chasing approval and started building competence. Competence builds confidence quietly. It does not need announcement. It does not require consensus. It simply exists. And once established, it becomes a source of internal security that external circumstances struggle to disrupt. This internal security also changes how men respond to criticism. When your identity is grounded in lived experience rather than external affirmation, criticism loses its sting. It is evaluated rather than absorbed. This detachment is often misinterpreted as coldness, but it is more accurately discernment. Discernment allows men to separate useful feedback from noise. Useful feedback is specific, consistent, and actionable. Noise is emotional, vague, and reactive. By disengaging from environments dominated by noise, men preserve their focus. This focus had ripple effects across multiple domains. Work performance improved. Financial planning became more disciplined. Health routines became more consistent. These improvements reinforced the decision to disengage further. It is important to understand that disengagement does not mean disengaging from life. It means disengaging from chaos. Men are still deeply engaged in pursuits that offer structure, predictability, and reward. They simply allocate their energy differently. This reallocation of energy exposed a critical imbalance in how social effort had been distributed. For a long time, male initiative was assumed. When that initiative was withdrawn, the imbalance became visible. Many interactions had relied on men providing momentum without acknowledgement. Momentum, once removed, reveals dependency. Dependency creates discomfort when it is no longer met. That discomfort is often framed as loss, but it is more accurately adjustment. Adjustment is not failure, it is recalibration. Systems recalibrate when inputs change. This recalibration phase is uncomfortable because it challenges assumptions that were previously invisible. One assumption being challenged is that social engagement is inherently beneficial. Engagement is only beneficial when it is mutual and balanced. When engagement becomes asymmetrical, withdrawal becomes protective. Another assumption being challenged is that silence indicates weakness. In reality, silence often indicates decision. People who are undecided talk. People who are settled act quietly. Men who have disengaged are not undecided. They have tested a different mode of living and found it sustainable. Sustainability is the ultimate metric. Anything that cannot be sustained eventually collapses. This is why attempts to frame male disengagement as a temporary phase are unlikely to succeed. Temporary phases feel unresolved. What we are observing instead is resolution. Men have resolved internal conflicts by choosing paths that reduce friction. This resolution changes how men view future commitments. They approach them cautiously and intentionally. They seek clarity up front. They avoid ambiguity. They value consistency over intensity. Intensity without consistency is draining. Consistency without drama is stabilizing. Many men now prioritize the latter. This prioritization affects how men assess potential partnerships. They look for predictability, mutual effort, and emotional steadiness. They are less tolerant of volatility. This does not mean they avoid emotion. It means they avoid instability. Instability is often mistaken for passion, but passion that disrupts peace eventually exhausts. Men who have found peace are reluctant to sacrifice it for fleeting excitement. This reluctance is not fear, it is preference shaped by experience. Once you know what peace feels like, you recognize its value. The broader implication of this shift is that attraction dynamics are changing. Attraction based on scarcity of attention operates differently than attraction based on abundance of choice. When attention becomes scarce by choice, its value increases. However, men are not deploying scarcity as a tactic. It is a byproduct of disengagement. This distinction matters. Tactics seek reaction. Disengagement seeks tranquility. This tranquility is difficult to counter because it does not demand response. It simply exists. And because it exists, it invites reflection. Reflection is uncomfortable for systems that rely on inertia. Inertia depends on people continuing to act out of habit. When habits change, inertia breaks. We are now in a period where old habits no longer apply universally. New patterns are emerging. These patterns favor autonomy, clarity, and self regulation. Self regulation is the cornerstone of this shift. Men are regulating their exposure to stress, conflict, and ambiguity. They are doing so intentionally and consistently. This regulation does not isolate them from reality, it filters reality. Filtering is not denial, it is prioritization. Everyone filters reality to some extent. The difference now is that men are filtering based on outcomes rather than expectations. They are asking simple questions. Does this add value? Does this create stability? Does this align with my goals? If the answer is no, disengagement follows without drama. This approach contrasts sharply with narratives that encourage constant engagement regardless of cost. Those narratives assume infinite resilience. Humans do not have infinite resilience, they have finite energy. Managing finite energy responsibly is a sign of maturity. Many men have reached that conclusion independently. As this mindset spreads, it will continue to reshape social norms. Norms adapt to behavior, not ideology. When enough people behave differently, norms follow. This does not require consensus, it requires repetition. Repetition creates expectation. Expectation creates norm. We are already seeing early stages of this norm shift. Conversations about boundaries are more common. Solitude is less stigmatized. Personal peace is increasingly valued. These changes will not reverse easily because they are rooted in lived experience rather than theory. Theory can be debated, experience cannot be argued away. As men settled into this new orientation toward life, another layer of change emerged, one that goes beyond behavior and into meaning. When you remove constant social pressure, you are left alone with fundamental questions. What matters to me? What am I building? What kind of life feels honest? These questions do not arise easily in environments filled with noise and expectation. They arise in quiet, and quiet has become the defining condition of this shift. Meaning does not announce itself. It forms slowly through alignment between values and actions. Many men discovered that when they stopped performing for external approval, they were able to identify what genuinely satisfied them. Satisfaction turned out to be less about intensity and more about continuity, not moments of excitement, but systems that worked day after day. This realization altered how men thought about the future. Long-term planning replaced short-term validation. Instead of chasing approval in the present, men began building foundations for later stability. Health routines were treated as investments. Financial discipline became non-negotiable. Skills were chosen for durability rather than trend appeal. This future-oriented mindset contrasts sharply with narratives that frame life as a series of emotional peaks. Peaks are unsustainable. They require constant input. Plateaus, by contrast, allow for growth without burnout. Men increasingly prefer plateaus with gradual upward movement. This preference affects how men think about legacy. Legacy is not built through constant visibility. It is built through consistency and contribution over time. Many men realize that stepping back from certain social arenas freed resources that could be redirected toward projects with lasting impact. Some invested in businesses, others in craftsmanship, others in mentoring younger men quietly and informally. These contributions rarely attract attention, but they compound. Quiet influence often outlasts loud persuasion. Another important development is how men relate to responsibility. Disengagement has not reduced responsibility, it has clarified it. Men are more selective about what they take responsibility for, but once they commit fully. This selectivity increases reliability. Reliability is undervalued in cultures obsessed with visibility, but reliability is the backbone of functioning systems. Men who disengage from chaotic environments often become pillars in stable ones. This is why the narrative that disengagement leads to social decay misses critical nuance. Disengagement from dysfunction can strengthen functional substructures. The collapse of one dynamic can coincide with the strengthening of another. We are witnessing a redistribution of male effort rather than its disappearance. Effort is flowing away from ambiguous social obligations and toward concrete personal and communal goals. This redistribution is rational and predictable. It also challenges assumptions about motivation. Traditional narratives often assume men are motivated primarily by external rewards. What we are seeing suggests otherwise. Men are strongly motivated by coherence, fairness, and control over outcomes. When these conditions are absent, motivation declines. When they are present, motivation flourishes. This principle applies universally, not just socially. Another effect of disengagement is how men process risk. Risk tolerance decreases when risks are poorly defined. Men prefer risks they can measure and manage. Ambiguous social risk is difficult to quantify. Financial or physical risk, by contrast, can often be assessed. This explains why many men channel energy into domains where feedback is clear. Fitness provides measurable results. Skills produce tangible outputs. Investments offer trackable performance. These domains reward effort predictably. Predictability builds trust. Trust encourages continued engagement. This feedback loop is absent in many social interactions, which is why those interactions are deprioritized. As trust in certain social systems eroded, men compensated by strengthening trust in themselves. Self trust is built through repeated evidence that you can rely on your own judgment. Disengagement created conditions for that evidence to accumulate. This self trust reduces susceptibility to pressure. When you trust your own experience, you are less likely to defer to narratives that contradict it. This independence is often mistaken for stubbornness, but it is more accurately conviction. Conviction stabilizes identity. Men with conviction are less reactive. They do not need to defend themselves constantly. Defense implies insecurity. Conviction implies settled belief. This settled belief is what makes re engagement unlikely without meaningful change. Men are not waiting to be convinced, they are observing whether conditions improve. Observation is passive but discerning. Now, observation also allows men to avoid cycles of disappointment. Rather than investing emotionally upfront, they wait for consistency. Consistency over time signals reliability. Without it, engagement does not occur. This approach frustrates those accustomed to immediate response. Delayed response can feel like rejection. In reality, it is evaluation. Evaluation takes time. Men are comfortable with that. They have learned that rushing decisions leads to regret. Patience, once developed, is difficult to abandon. Another subtle shift is how men relate to competition. Competition used to be social as well as professional. Status, attention, and validation were arenas of contest. Many men have exited those arenas entirely. Exiting competition does not mean rejecting excellence, it means redefining the arena. Men now compete primarily with their past selves. Progress is measured internally rather than comparatively. This internal competition is sustainable because it does not depend on external benchmarks. It rewards consistency and discipline rather than spectacle. Spectacle is exhausting. It demands constant escalation. Internal progress does not. It rewards steady effort. And this change has implications for mental health. Constant comparison fuels anxiety. Reducing comparison reduces stress. Many men report improved mental health after disengaging from comparison driven environments. Improved mental health reinforces the decision to disengage. When a choice improves well being, it becomes self validating. Another consequence of disengagement is the recalibration of expectations around intimacy. Men are less willing to enter emotionally volatile situations. They value emotional steadiness and mutual accountability. This does not indicate emotional avoidance, it indicates emotional selectivity. Men are not avoiding connection, they are avoiding instability. Instability consumes energy that could be used for growth. Men who have experienced stability are reluctant to sacrifice it. This reluctance reshapes dating dynamics, but more importantly, it reshapes self perception. Men see themselves less as providers of experience and more as custodians of their own well being. Custodianship implies responsibility. Men are taking responsibility for their mental and emotional environment. That responsibility includes deciding who and what has access to them. Access used to be granted generously, it is now granted selectively. This selectivity is not punitive, it is protective. Protection is necessary when boundaries have been crossed repeatedly. Boundaries do not form in a vacuum, They form in response to experience. Another point worth emphasizing is that disengagement does not eliminate compassion. Many men retain empathy without exposure. They care without immersing themselves in conflict. This balance preserves emotional energy. Compassion without boundaries leads to exhaustion. Compassion with boundaries leads to sustainability. Men are learning this distinction. And so sustainability is the unifying theme of this shift. Sustainable routines, sustainable relationships, sustainable expectations. Anything unsustainable is eventually abandoned. This is not cynicism, it is pragmatism. Pragmatism values what works over what sounds good. Men are prioritizing outcomes over narratives. Narratives still exist, but they no longer dictate behavior. Behavior is guided by experience. Experience is cumulative. Each positive outcome reinforces the path chosen. Each avoided negative outcome validates restraint. Over time, restraint becomes wisdom. Wisdom does not seek validation, it simply guides action. This is why the tone of disengaged men is often calm rather than confrontational. Confrontation implies unresolved conflict. Calm implies resolution. A resolution does not mean agreement, it means closure. Men have closed a chapter in their lives. They are not burning it, they are shelving it. Shelving something means it is no longer central. It does not require constant attention. This frees cognitive resources. Freed resources are invested elsewhere. As this investment continues, new identities form. Men identify as builders, learners, caretakers of their own lives. These identities are quieter but more resilient. Resilience comes from autonomy. Autonomy comes from self trust. Self trust comes from lived experience. This chain explains why disengagement persists even when criticized. Criticism does not undo experience. As this shift continues to unfold, the most important thing to understand is that it is not driven by ideology, anger, or nostalgia. It is driven by lived experience. Men did not arrive here through persuasion. They arrived here through observation, trial, error, and ultimately resolution. Resolution is quiet. It does not protest. It does not demand recognition. It simply chooses what works and lets go of what does not. What we are witnessing now is the long tail of accumulated decisions. Each man who stepped back did so independently, often without encouragement, often without validation, and often without explanation. Over time, those independent decisions formed a recognizable pattern. That pattern is not a movement in the traditional sense. It has no slogans, no leaders, no membership. It is simply behavior aligning with incentive. When behavior aligns with incentive, it persists. That is the rule that governs markets, biology, and human psychology alike. You can argue with narratives. You cannot argue with outcomes. And the outcomes men are experiencing after disengagement are reinforcing the choice again and again. Many men now describe their lives using words that rarely appeared in public conversation before: calm, order, focus, clarity. These are not words associated with withdrawal or defeat. They are words associated with alignment. When a life feels aligned, it stops producing internal friction. Friction is what exhausts people. Remove friction, and energy returns. With that energy, men are building lives that make sense to them, even if those lives do not conform to outdated expectations. They are redefining success on their own terms. Success is no longer measured by how visible they are, how desired they are, or how much attention they receive. It is measured by how stable their days feel and how predictable their progress becomes. This redefinition of success has profound implications. It means fewer men are willing to sacrifice long term stability for short term approval. It means fewer men are willing to enter dynamics where effort is expected but not reciprocated. It means fewer men are willing to negotiate boundaries that were already made clear through experience. None of this requires hostility. It requires honesty. And honesty, when practiced consistently, simplifies life. Another truth that must be acknowledged is that many men did not realize how much pressure they were under until that pressure was removed. Chronic pressure becomes invisible to those living inside it. Relief, by contrast, is immediately noticeable. Once experienced, it becomes difficult to ignore. This is why calls to return to old norms ring hollow. You cannot convince someone to give up peace once they have found it. You cannot persuade someone that chaos is meaningful when stability has proven otherwise. People protect what improves their lives. The broader cultural conversation has struggled to keep up with this reality because it often focuses on intent rather than effect. Intent matters less than outcome. Systems can have good intentions and still produce harmful effects. When those effects accumulate, people adapt. Adaptation is not rebellion, it is survival. Men adapted by reducing exposure to environments that produce stress without benefit. They adapted by narrowing their focus. They adapted by becoming more selective. They adapted by choosing solitude over noise, clarity over confusion, and stability over volatility. This adaptation has consequences. Some relationships never form, some dynamics dissolve, some expectations go unmet. That discomfort is real. But discomfort does not invalidate the choice, it simply marks transition. Every major social shift produces discomfort because it disrupts assumptions. Assumptions feel safe until they stop matching reality. When they stop matching reality, people must adjust. Adjustment requires responsibility on all sides. Not blame, not accusation, responsibility. Responsibility begins with acknowledging cause and effect honestly. Men did not disengage because they were told to. They disengaged because they learned to. Learning changes behavior more reliably than instruction ever could. This is also why attempts to shame or pressure men back into participation fail. Pressure only works when people feel dependent. Independence neutralizes pressure. Men who have rebuilt their lives around autonomy are not waiting for permission. They are not seeking justification. They are simply living differently. Living differently does not mean living selfishly. Many men contribute quietly to their families, communities, and professions. They simply do so without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk or instability. Contribution without chaos is not abandonment, it is refinement. Refinement improves systems by removing inefficiency. Inefficiency drains energy. Efficient systems endure. As more men refine their lives in this way, social expectations will continue to shift whether acknowledged or not. Norms do not persist through enforcement alone. They persist because people choose them willingly. When people stop choosing them, norms change. This is not the end of society. It is a reconfiguration. Some old pathways close, new ones form. That is how adaptation works. The real question is not whether men will return to old patterns. The real question is whether new patterns will be built on honesty, reciprocity, and realism rather than assumption and entitlement. That outcome depends on whether lessons are learned or ignored. Men have already learned theirs. They have learned the value of peace. They have learned the cost of chaos. They have learned that being alone is not the same as being lost. They have learned that self respect begins with boundaries. Those lessons do not fade easily. They are reinforced daily through lived experience. If there is one thing this entire discussion should make clear, it is this: men did not disappear, they redirected. Their energy did not vanish, it was reclaimed. Reclaimed energy builds quietly, it does not announce itself. But over time, it reshapes lives, communities, and cultures. We are only beginning to see the long term effects of this redirection. They will not be obvious all at once. They will appear gradually through changed expectations, altered priorities, and new definitions of fulfillment. Whether those changes lead to healthier systems depends on whether honesty replaces denial. You cannot solve a problem you refuse to see. You cannot rebuild trust without accountability. And you cannot expect engagement from those who have already found peace elsewhere. At this point, the most constructive step forward is not argument, but reflection. What incentives exist? What outcomes are being produced? What behaviors are being reinforced? People follow what works. As we close this video, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed? Do you agree with the patterns described here? Have you observed similar changes in your own life or in the people around you? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations matter and they only move forward when people speak honestly about what they see. Like the video if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.